Welcome to the Pixel Retentive Podcast, where we, a business owner and an artist, discuss the business of art and the art of business. Hey friends, I'm Carl, founder of Epic Made, and with me today I have a special guest host, Ryan Summers.
Thanks so much, Carl. I'm Ryan. I'm an animation director, and I've worked with people like Guillermo del Toro and places like Warner Brothers, among others, and also, more importantly, a past guest here on Pixel Retentive Podcast. And we're the hosts of the Pixel Retentive Podcast, where we share our thoughts on creativity, art, and business.
Past guests include Alexi Valdivia of Alice Wonders, Jeremy Schuback, who's worked with some of the top journalists, and Dan Nelkin, author of a self-help guide for copywriters. We're forever grateful for the supporters of our podcast, and as always, we're looking for more sponsors. That said, Pixel Retentive is brought to you by the creative gurus at Epic Made. Epic Made is a team of strategists and artists who excel in visual storytelling. Our studio crafts unforgettable animations and illustrations that not only captivate your audience, but also drive tangible business results. We specialize in engaging imaginative, pop culture savvy audiences with beloved clients like Nickelodeon, WWE, and Sci-Fi. Visit getepicmade.com and let's collaborate on your next creative campaign.
And with us today, we have a big one. We have Fred Seibert. Fred is the media and tech entrepreneur behind some of the most iconic cartoons and digital platforms. He founded FredFilms and Frederator Studios and produced some little shows like Adventure Time, Fairly OddParents, and Castlevania. Also in tech, he was Tumblr's first investor, founded Next New Networks, which was acquired by YouTube, and backed Muckrake early on. As a co-founder and the first creator, let me say that line again. As a co-founder and the first creative director of MTV, he co-created the legendary I Want My MTV campaign and helped shape Nickelodeon's original branding. And before all that, he made jazz and blues records.
Amazing. Fred, living legend, as you might be aware. So grateful to have you back on the podcast. And if you guys
thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man. Dude, this is gonna be fun. Just gonna jump into all the weeds with you today. I usually ask everyone at the beginning of the podcast, how long you've been in the industry and what project are you most proud of? But I think let's do it. Why not? I feel like you've been in here for a minute. So, yeah.
Well, I've been around for about 50 years in, some version of our industry or not. And I'm really fond of saying I'm proud of everything. Like it's like kids. You don't want to in any way think that one is better than the other. You got in the back of your head, what's better, what's not quite as good. But, I'm thrilled I'm thrilled to have done what I've done. And I'm thrilled to thinking about what I'm going to be doing next.
I love that. Ryan and I were talking a little bit before the show, and it's amazing the amount of things you've touched over the years that just all these little spots across all the different parts of culture and technology. And I mean, you've shaped an entire generation of human beings and creatives and young minds just with all the for good or, whatever that interpretation is, but no, literally just so much opportunity and creativity and just really cool things, man. Just fun and at the least entertaining. Right. So,
Well, I'm really lucky. I got into this in part because I wanted to do just what you said. I wanted to be in the slipstream of conversation. In my case, it started because I was just admired the records that I loved, and I wanted to be part of that. And, I think I've described many times before that I feel like I'm a ping pong ball in the wind tunnel of pop culture. And I've been lucky to really just sort of flit around to all sorts of stuff, not being particularly good at any of them, but being admiring of the people who are good and doing my best to be able to help them one way or another.
Well, I mean, that is a thing that I think when we were looking back before the call, I was like, what do I even bring up? What do I talk about? And it's almost like there was this secret Wizard of Oz that was pulling strings of all the creators that you love, right? And not just after they've already found their success. When I go down the list of people like Gendy, I think of Rob Renzetti, I think of Craig McCracken, and you look at who was there at the beginning, it all leads back to one person. It leads back to you, which is amazing. All the other things that are all, the other things are amazing. Like we could talk for a whole hour about like the importance of MTV, not just on culture, but just animation, right? But then even later, all the tech investment. But for me, it comes back down to just I don't know if you found these people, if you were their champion, but the fact that you were connected with so many people who have shaped animation for more than one generation at this point, at their earliest start, like that is the thing that just was the hallmark to me that was so amazing.
Well, I'm doing a self-published book now, just, for swag for my business. And I'm doing it on the original MTV logo,
Awesome.
which I have a few hundred of which in my folders somewhere. And as I'm writing the introduction, it's because I had a friend when I was 5 years old who was a fantastic artist that I even noticed at 5 that he was a fantastic artist.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I put the dedication to him in the book,
Oh, wow.
it's a picture of when we had a picnic across the street from our suburban house when we were 5 or 6 years old, eating sandwiches. And it goes back that far that my admiration for talented people and my desire to like be near them has sort of fueled my entire work life, it turns out.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And it takes a team, right? Like we often in our culture, especially like with the successful creative side of things, like we build up the creatives and these artists and these individuals, but like we don't have the business acumen and just the connector behind the strings. I like what Ryan said, sort of the Wizard of Oz. Like we need that. It's massively important. If that part falls down, none of the rest of it even gets to anybody's eyeballs, right? Like it doesn't happen if someone's not making the deals and moving the business. So,
well, advocacy, that advocacy, I feel like is just the biggest thing that it's. I think anyone who's listening to this right now, that's like, how do I get where I need to go? It's finding that first advocate. I would imagine whether it's just building a self-belief in them, or then I'm sure to where you were growing to like getting them the right exposure and connecting the dots for them to take their next step.
Well, probably the thing that you guys both know is, in all probability, your first advocates were in your family, because people don't let people become artists in the world that we live in all that easily.
No.
And it's a hard road, and your parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and sisters and brothers tend to know that it's a hard path, and probably on one hand work to discourage you, and on the other hand work to support you, or else you never could have gotten to where you are.
Right.
So that's with my case, I think I might have said on the last podcast, because I say it everywhere, the thing that changed my life was my fandom for the Beatles.
Oh, wow.
And what that has kind of meant is I've always seen bands as my model. And I played different roles in bands. I played instruments when I was a kid, and that was my first role in a band. And then I sort of moved behind the glass and started recording bands. And, that was, and like on and on and on, all those pieces. I think of everything in terms of band metaphors, like all the time. And it's right. It takes a band, right?
Yes. Sidebar within that same, as part of music television.
Oh my God, this guy.
Dude, Fred sent me these. Thank you so much, Fred. Like, my dad put on one, I guess early on when MTV was first coming up, he had a theater in Virginia Beach, and he had a big MTV thing, and he just had this huge box full of these buttons, and they got rusty in the shed eventually and were thrown out. But I just this, look at these things, man. This stuff.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
And because I sent those to you, Carl, I pulled out 3 that I'm going to frame. And I realized that I sent you the last one with the 1-year birthday cake, which is fun. It's the one in the middle, the white one in the middle.
Oh, this one's cool. This one reminds me of the MTV animation. Yeah, like the style, that late night. Man, look, I'm happy to send this back if you need this.
No. Hey, it's fine. For junk as it is. But my buddy, who was one of the key designers of that MTV logo, the guy I've known since I was 5,
Yeah.
He actually illustrated that cake.
Oh,
So there you go.
amazing.
Yeah.
You know what's crazy is when I see that, it just fires up. I don't even want to say nostalgia. It immediately fires up like this strong desire to open up like whatever program of choice or get and just start animating, because
make some cool shit.
There is this, I mean, and we must just be of this generation where there's this very potent like fanned animation pipeline that almost started from like those interstitials during Sesame Street, and then right when you're aware that people made this stuff, MTV hits and all the interstitials, all the liquid television, all the like all those things. And then it was almost like the Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon era, and then Frederator. And all of a sudden it's like there's just this pipeline from like, what is this? Oh, I could do this. Oh, I can make a living doing this. Wait, this is very powerful. And it's amazing. When you just pull those up, it just strikes that fire in me immediately of like, oh, when everybody was just about that teenage time, we're like, what can I do for a living? What are my hobbies? What's my avocation? You're like, oh, it's this. This is what I want. And I feel like I would love to talk about it, because I feel like when you say bands and that whole like, it's one thing to have 4 people in the band. It's another thing to create the street team. It's another thing to get that 5th and 6th person, whether it's like the producer or the manager. I feel like we are at an era that maybe the people who are doing it don't know. The people who are 15, 16, 17, 20 years old, they don't have that touch point. But that's exactly what people are starting to do right now with indie animation. Like people are starting to come up and they're finding their little community. And they might find somebody who can know how to build an audience. And they have another person who's starting to figure out the business sense of it. I feel like there's a world where you are like, as Neil Young was to grunge, I feel like Fred Seibert is to potentially the next generation of animators, because you have all of that experience and knowledge. And I feel like it's kind of missing just in the current kind of like dialogue from those young animators, but it's right there for people to find out.
It's funny because as we talked about offline, what we think of as the TV business is in complete chaos, hyper chaos.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that has affected my business really directly, because one of the sort of core tenets of my business is originality, original stuff.
Yeah.
And because of that, I tended always to work with first timers.
Right.
And right now, the mainstream industry isn't all that interested in first time. They seem to want to have a preconceived notion of what succeeds or doesn't.
Yeah.
And after like years of beating my head against that wall, which I continue to do on a daily basis, I started thinking again, like, okay, why did I sell my YouTube business? Because that is the place where original thinking is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that original thinking is a 12-year-old who has bought some kind of animation program and has figured out how to make something jump across the screen.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it has matured into an incredibly potent arena of original material that's going on that is going to be the next wave of mainstream successes, or what passes in the modern world for mainstream success, because it's changed.
Right.
In the world of technology and streaming, it's changed so much that there's no single arbiter anymore of mainstream success.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm looking at that very closely after years of having walked away from it, because, and those kids who are figuring that out, they're the ones, right? They're the ones that are going to reestablish the Spider-Mans of the future.
100%. Yeah. If you ask my kid, like, who his favorite TV personalities, well, they're all YouTubers, right? Like all the content he knows is YouTube. He's 13. He's 13. Yeah. Yes. So everything he knows, like that's where he consumes content is YouTube almost exclusively. Like he'll get on some streaming platforms, but if he's buying a video game or he wants a toy or any kind of thing, it's because he saw it on YouTube from some influencer that was playing the game or talking about the thing or whatever. It drives all of the commerce of that age group. And those kids are going to mature into adults in the next, over the next decade. And their whole cultural experience growing up was all YouTube. Like
that's awesome. Yeah.
I was telling a friend the other day who I've been talking with this about a business proposition in this, that YouTube in many ways has become what in my generation, FM radio was.
Yep.
Right. Which is that transfer from like the top 40 of AM radio into what we now think of as sort of the classic rock era. The truth is, I started in radio, and when I got into commercial radio, I grew up in the New York area and I started working in the New York area. And it was the first time I realized as an adult working that there were 78 radio stations in New York. In my mind, there were 3. Right? Were the 2 top 40 stations I listened to and the 1 FM station I listened to. And it didn't occur to me that all those other numbers on the dial represented, you're from Milwaukee, the Polish channel, and the R&B channel, and the news channel, and like all those different communities. And that's what we have now in the YouTubes and Twitches of the world, except that there are 50 million communities.
Yeah.
So again, that definition of mainstream success
is
radically different than what we used to think of. Oh, well, everybody watched, Seinfeld, Game of Thrones, whatever it might be. We're never going to have everybody watching anything again, except our friends.
Exactly.
Oh.
I mean, I think that's why it's such an interesting time for animation, because like I used to always think like, well, as AM radio is to podcasts, like YouTube is as a potential audience almost to like for people who want to get an animation, didn't know how to, because you may not be the Mr. Beast of the world, but you may be able to find enough people like a touring band who maybe wasn't the Stones, but they have enough people who follow them that they can go to enough cities to just like that's the dream. Can you find enough people that can pay you enough money to make enough to continue doing it, and then maybe grow it from there if you're ambitious?
Well, Don Hertzfeld, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
Don Hertzfeld is sort of like the poster boy for I figured out my own way to go. Now it's not a way, like it's not something that I do, but it's something that he does. And that's more important than what I do.
I feel like we're at the beginning waves of that now when I see stuff like Has Been Hotel or Amazing Digital Circus, and even the Jellybox guys, the guys who did the Union videos, and now they're kickstarting their whole that I don't even know what you would call that. That's not a work stream. It's not a pipeline, but that whole approach of like build small.
Well, everybody's just trying to survive and do their own thing. The Jellybox guys have a tough time working in the mainstream industry, right? The Digital Circus, well, the Glitch team is what I should say, are like, two little, 20-something brothers in Sydney, Australia, who like have been satisfied making Nintendo parodies and said, hey, maybe we could do something more.
Right.
Vivienne is a classic go it yourself, alone artist. Leave me alone. I want to do what the fuck I want to do. Right. And this is a world where all of those things can exist and, battle it out among themselves, find out whether there's an audience for what they like.
Yeah, there's a lot less. Well, the gatekeepers have changed, but the floor to entry is way less than it's ever been, right? Like
completely.
You can make entertaining content about literally almost any subject matter, and if you do it right and you market it right, you build yourself up the right way, you can make $100,000 as an artist, and no one really knows who you are, and you have a tiny little community, but you can live a nice life on 100K in most parts of the United States. I mean, maybe not anymore, but like it's
Well, back to my band analogy, it's for me, it's the difference between a symphony orchestra and a garage band.
Yeah.
Right. And then right in the nexus of those two things is Taylor Swift. Right. Who is, probably the single smartest marketer in entertainment today.
Sure.
Who figured out these tools like a long time ago when she was, she wasn't even a teenager, I think, when she started figuring this stuff out. And she had world-changing ambitions, so she did. And then there's the band that is happy to have a few thousand followers.
Right.
Right. But none of those people can become the symphony in the same sense that the symphony always was, where you got together 100 people and you you had a very complex composer who put together, all of this type of stuff. But this world allows now, and, it allows in a big way, you to amass whatever audience you're trying to amass. The last time I put an original piece of animation on YouTube was 10, 11 years ago. And I died and went to heaven when we got 10 million views in a month, because in those days, to Carl's son's view of things, it was all influencers, right? And I call influencers talk show hosts. They're all Oprah to me, at some level or other, or they're Jeff Probst, and scripted stuff was just had not found its way in the YouTube space. Now, Amazing Digital Circus comes out 18 months ago, 100 million views in the first month. Now, yes, that's indicative of something about Amazing Digital Circus. It's indicative of something about Glitch and their ability to build an audience. But what it's most indicative of is that there have been multiple audiences that are Carl's son who have started to look at YouTube as their primary, location. The guy who developed Adventure Time in my studio recently was talking to a high school class. I think they were like 16, juniors, maybe something like that. Not one of them had even heard of Adventure Time.
Adventure Time. It's amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
And which makes perfect sense, but they probably all knew Hazbin Hotel.
Right.
Right.
That's an amazing thing that I'm finding recently, is that I still think that whether it's the TV experience, it's the story building for that type of audience, it's still valuable, though, I feel like, because YouTube seemingly, it's amazing to me that YouTube has recently been saying that more people are actually watching YouTube on their TVs, sitting on their couch, than they are.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That they are on their computers, and that they're starting to go back to creators and starting to create a format. And it's this wild new thing called a show that's easily organized, and they have like a linear sense of like, you should play them in this order, and it's almost a revelation to a lot of the creators that are trying to figure out what's the next step. It was shorts.
So I happened to have a meeting yesterday with an animator from Israel.
Wow.
And I had the same conversation I've had now thousands of times, hundreds of times over the last 20 years. Because he has an idea, they've started creating a show and blah, blah, blah. It's related to this and that and the other thing. And I said, he said, we're ready. We're going to get investors. I said, great. How are you going to pay your investors back? Where's the money? Well, we're going to do this and we're do that. We're going to have T-shirts and we're going to have merch. And I said, really? Where are people going to see this thing? He said, well, we'll start on YouTube. And I said, oh, okay. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to get, viewers? He went, well, I'm putting it on YouTube. And I said, well, there's a real difference between making something and getting an audience.
Right.
And he looked at me weirdly. And I said, well, there's a real difference between being Taylor Swift, who makes music, and the stadium, who sells tickets to put asses in the seats, make sure that the hot dogs are warm, making sure that the bathrooms work, and making sure that there's enough security that people can get out of the stadium without killing each other. Those are two different businesses.
Yes.
And, YouTube, you're in the stadium business. You're not in the making business. And he just looked at me like I had three heads.
Yeah, like you're speaking a totally separate language, probably. Like,
well, it is a different language because, I lived on both sides of that. I was first, I worked in media, I was a radio guy. I became a television programmer.
mm-hmm.
That's really, and I didn't make much. I wasn't in the making business. What I was the guy that would get 100 records every week and go, which record should we play? And what order should we play them in? And, what should the DJs do? And do we have commercials? Do we not have commercials? Do we have jingles? Do we not have, all that stuff had nothing to do with how the Beatles made their record.
Right.
And they didn't really care about what we did to get the record out to people. And in a lot of ways, we didn't really care what they did to make the records, right? We were at that moment, we were in different things. And now these, what we'll so-called creators have no idea what it's like to succeed at anything. It's hard enough for them to make the thing. I have a 27-year-old son who just quit his job as a computer programmer to try and become a film director kind of out of nowhere. Like he's not one of those guys that made films his whole life. And I know when I take him to lunch next week and I suggest that he ought to start thinking about his social platform, which he has, by the way, up until this point in life, been allergic to.
Oh, no.
And he's going to tell me to jump in a lake, not because he doesn't necessarily agree or disagree, but because he's still trying to figure out how to make a movie.
Right.
Which is its whole own level of hell, which has nothing to do with building an audience, which is, by the way, part of the requirement to be a filmmaker.
Absolutely.
Who can make more films today, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't require you to make your first film. You don't have to do anything with an audience, but to keep making films, like, what are you going to do? You better find your own audience because no one else is going to find it for you.
That's kind of the Pandora's box, right? Like before it was almost impossible to do that. But now that you do have Patreon and Kickstarter and Substacks and YouTube, the box is open. Yes, you can now do it, but now you have to, right? Like you have to almost have that like split down the middle. Or have a partner that's great at it.
It's always been true. My wife is in the music business and worked with, major people, Nirvana, Metallica. And yesterday, she got a call from a friend of my son's who has a band and wants to know about getting a manager. And I heard her, overheard her conversation. And basically what she was going is like, you have to do everything yourself.
Right.
And they're like, what? No. I mean, my lawyer does this and my manager does this and my booking. And okay, here's the deal. You can't trust anybody. You better do it all yourself.
Right.
And that person's not going to listen and they're not going to do well. But by the way, as it ever was, Benny Goodman had to do it himself. In the 1930s, when he had a band and had to figure out a way to like pay the band.
Right.
And had to figure out a way to get a booking that would pay him enough to pay the band. Like, it's
always part of it's always been part of it, right?
It's always been part of the puzzle. Yes, you can paint on your own in your room,
right,
and make wonderful art, but it doesn't mean that anyone will pay attention to your art.
Yeah. Well, and so the marketing side, right? That's essentially kind of what you could bucket that into the business and marketing side, like creating things, like we said, we were talking earlier, creators have a need to create, right? Like if you're an artist, you're going to make things, they might be good, they might be terrible, they might be whatever, but if you don't build a community around it through marketing and promotion and all the different aspects of that, you don't treat that part with as much care and consideration and detail, like it's never going to go anywhere. Like it's it's going to be hobby art that makes you feel good. Whenever you have to make, because you need to make.
Well, by the way, it could be great art too,
Sure,
but that's not the issue.
that isn't the issue, right? That's not the business. That's not the problem with why you may or may not be successful, right? Like, for sure.
Well, they are two different, one of the things it's really interesting as, Carl, I know, and you probably know, Ryan, also, just historically, most of the series I've made came from short films.
Right.
And
oh my gosh, yeah.
The reason I made short films wasn't just because I like Looney Tunes. It was also because I came out of the music business where people made singles before they made albums,
Right.
And it led people to the impression that what I was like a school for helping students, make films. And I said, no, I'm in a different business. That's a great thing to do. And for teachers and for certain kinds of people who think that way, that's great. My gig is I was looking for the person who was one step away from world class, because my personal goal is I wanted to do world class popular things, right? I'm in the pop business.
Right.
And I was not looking for people who showed hints of talent. I was looking for people who were filmmakers who were ready to make that leap.
Yeah.
Which is and in order for them to get to that place, they had to do a lifetime's worth of work before we even met.
Yeah.
Right. Like they did the hard work. Like I was just like the last diving board, that they could jump off of, that's
super valuable, crazy valuable. And then when you're talking about your time, like the best thing for you to invest your time into is that person who, you're the last cog in the wheel to put this machine on the racetrack and start going, right? Like that makes all the sense in the world. And I think if people are framing that up in their head, like, hey, look, you built a thing, you've got all this stuff. You need to get as far as you possibly can on your own before you expect anyone else to jump in or help you. And then you're less of that trust factor where someone's going to steal something from you too, because you're in more control. So,
well, I heard my wife overheard my wife talking to this band, and she mentioned the Metallica managers. It's a company called Q Prime. They're the most successful pop music managers in the world today. And they only had one major criteria. There are a lot of minor criteria for signing a band. And here's what the major criteria was. Are you selling tickets on your own?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They're not even going to return your email unless they have a sense that you've built some kind of audience on your own and you're ready to go the next step. And it's the same thing. Again, it is this. I have a friend who is a wonderful writer. She made her living for most of her life as a copywriter and advertising and marketing and all that type of stuff. But you would go to her house and literally there were piles like taller than you were of paper of novels she had written, nonfiction books she had written. And I'd go, aren't you going to, are you going to get it published? Are you going to share? No, I'm just writing.
That's just what they do. They can't stop it. They can't help it.
Right. And that's what, and people have their own desires. There are some people who all they want to do is make the stuff. Right. There are other people who all they want to do is succeed. And then there's sort of the people who have a bit of both. Right. I would make personally the argument that Taylor Swift doesn't write the greatest songs or make the greatest records ever. But she wants to succeed more than anything else. When I first met Mr. Beast, now going back 5 or 6 years ago, he was the only guy who gave me an honest answer when I said, so why are you doing this? And he said, well, I always wanted to be rich and famous.
That's awesome. Right.
And it's a really it is this sort of separating factor when I talk publicly often about the fact that I was the one who turned down Adventure Time in my office. And luckily I had a couple colleagues who told me I was an idiot. And I said, okay, well, I really laughed. It wasn't my fake laugh that I usually have. let me meet Penn. I want to meet Penn and just find out like, what is he about?
Right.
And so we sat down, we were talking, and he, at the time he was 21 and I was 50 something, right? And he said, well, I grew up with the cartoons you made at Hanna-Barbera, and I really wanted to do stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, he wants to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you ask Penn Ward, do you want to succeed? He would absolutely, no. It was not a conscious part of his being from my perspective. I mean, you'd have to ask him, but it was clear he wanted to make stuff for an audience like him.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's really like the easiest thing. And that was like, okay, that was my final tipping point to say, okay, let's try this. The guy wants it to work. He doesn't want to just do what he feels like doing. He also wants it to work on the basis of an audience.
Yeah. I feel like those are always the shows that stand out from the class of the people around them. Those are always ones where it's like they just want to tell a story and have it resonate to someone, typically something that looks like in the mirror, but those stick out versus just I have 4 targets, I want to hit 3 of the 4 and make sure we hit a certain, those sometimes work too, but the ones that stand the test of time that people still talk about inevitably come from that source.
Well, it's funny, when I met my wife on a blind date, she was the first one that really like knocked it into my head. And I was old already. I was 40 at that point. And I thought it was about talented people. And she said, oh, well, yeah, but they have to want it. I go, what do you mean? She said, well, they can be great, but if they don't want it, like, it's the people who want it who get it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love what you said though too. It's sometimes the ones who don't know how to verbalize that. I having this epiphany in my head going off from everything you're saying by trying to create this connection or this metaphor of animation artists to bands, right? Because we all know that one person that could play the guitar amazingly, but they can never stick in a band for long enough. They didn't care about winning. They were worried about selling out or whatever that might be. And then there's somebody else who could barely plunk together 3 chords, but they just had something when you saw them on stage. And I remember growing up in Chicago when the Smashing Pumpkins were coming out and they sounded awful. I remember seeing them and they were not good, but you could tell, and this is used as a derisive term, they were careerists. At least Billy was like, he had an idea that he fit somewhere in the pantheon of rock gods and he was gonna do it. And then it all fell together. But you're like, even the people who are saying that they don't think it's about success, there's something internally. And having that ability to like identify it, Fred, is, I don't know many people in history who have that ability to like actually sniff that out.
I was 50 or 60 before I realized I was ambitious, because I always thought of ambition as a dirty word. It struck me as like somebody who was like kind of slimy and, pushing too hard, and which I probably was doing. But Butch Hartman, who's the creator of the Fairly OddParents, and I were speaking at an event. And I spoke first, and then he was going to follow me. And the moderator said, hey, why don't you guys talk together for a couple minutes? And somebody in the audience asked the question, and they said, well, how'd you guys get together? And Butch said, well, I was an artist at Hanna-Barbera, and Fred came in working, and I realized he was ambitious. And, I'm ambitious too. And I figured, okay, if we got together, maybe something could happen.
Wow.
And it wasn't until that moment that I realized, oh, he's right. Now, I wasn't ambitious in the sense, like, I didn't want to make the most money. I didn't want to I wanted the biggest show, right? But I had my own personal goals. I guess that's really what it was. And I worked on those personal goals in any way that I could. And by the way, most of them didn't work. Like, I never made a Beatles record. Right? Like I never got there. Right? I never made a wonderful album or even a wonderful album cover. So that when I started working on MTV and those little animations, I said, oh, these could be my album covers. Right. I could do for this world what album covers did for me. But it wasn't clearly in my head that I had an ambition. I didn't want to be Jimmy and be rich and famous. So that would have been a nice byproduct. You know, but as my wife explained to me, you would never get that byproduct unless that's what you wanted.
Right.
Anyway.
I mean, how awesome is it to have somebody self-identify that though for you? Like that's one of those things you almost could wish back. Like I wish somebody would have pulled that out of me 10 years earlier. Because what would I have done?
But I was,
or who knows, right?
It worked out okay. I mean, I've had a better life and more happening in it than I ever could have imagined.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I have in a completely indirect way, I have more than accomplished what I ever dreamed I would accomplish.
Yeah.
It never occurred to me that any of this could happen.
Right. I say something, I've not accomplished anything on the level that you have, obviously, but
You have.
I have an amazing life. And like I set a lot of these arbitrary goals at like a 20-year-old spunky, like I'm going to be an entrepreneur and I'm going to be on Forbes by 30. And I just turned 40 last week. And I'm just,
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's like, I felt like when I look back on everything that like, I have a nice house, a nice piece of land and a nice life. And I wake up relatively stress-free most days. And like, life's really nice. And it's like, I can't put my finger on any like one great success I've done. And in fact, if I look back at the past, I started this company in 2006. And if I look back on the past, almost 20 years now, I've been failing the whole time, just in the right direction, just bolting it together and scrapping it by. And then, next thing you know, it's like, I make more money than I need and I live life completely on my own terms. And I have unlimited potential to do amazing things. And I've surrounded myself with people that I love. And it's just like pushing yourself to just keep moving forward and not taking no for an answer, not going, oh my God, that didn't happen exactly how I planned. I'm a failure. I need to go do something else. Like just keep loving the journey. Like, and that seems to be the thing.
I talk all the time. I grew up in a family of a mom and pop business. My parents were pharmacists and my mother's father before her was a pharmacist. And my dad's father had a little general store in the country. And so I grew up, like working.
Mm-hmm.
Like my parents literally put me to work because they couldn't afford babysitters when I was 5. And in retrospect, I learned that there really are a couple different kinds of people. One is the one who works to live.
Yep. Oh my God.
But I feel like I lucked out in that I live to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, as I'm getting older, it's a real challenge because I don't know what like retirement means because I like what I do because I only do what I like.
Yeah.
I've had a job where I didn't like it. I stopped doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
And started something else.
So much self-sovereignty there, right? Like how many people don't get that in their life at all? And in retirement, they go get another job they hate, just to pay the bill.
Well, it's a really interesting thing, that there's been a lot of criticism of the type of people who say, well, you have to do what you love. And what that misses, at least for me, is there's a lot of stuff I love. And sure, I started out wanting to be a record guy and make records. And really, there was nothing else on my mind. Absolutely, like I was like this. But I didn't have the right personality, right? Like on 100 different levels, I didn't have the right, and for the business, for the creative, like whatever, I didn't have the right personality. But I kept moving in a path that was a path that would lead me to other things that I love. I had no desire to be in cartoons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Before that, I had no desire to be in advertising. In fact, I said to a roommate of mine once, if you ever find me getting into advertising, buy me a gun so I can shoot myself. Right? But every one of those milestones led me to something else. And then, there's always the fork in the road. and I get to a new fork in the road. And honestly, like, I turned down the first offer I had to be in television. I turned down the first offer I had to be in cartoons. I turned down the first offer I had to be in the internet. Right? Every one of those crossroads changed my life.
Right.
But my first instinct was, no, I don't do that. I don't do I said to the guy who offered me what became the MTV job, I said, I watch television. I don't make it.
Wow.
From Fred. That's just funny, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because we've spent like Ryan and I probably spent hundreds of hours of our life watching television that you to calculate.
Yeah, you could.
No, I get it. And by the way, literally within a month of my being in television, I realized I was in the right place.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But my instinct, because again, even when I took the job, in the back of my mind, I might have even said it to some of my friends. Well, if I could get an A&R job at a record company that paid me half as much, I'd take that.
Right.
Because that was my, at that point, decade-long goal. Right. Thank God it didn't happen, because again, I was the wrong guy for that job.
But you wouldn't have known it. I have to kindly request, Fred, before we wrap up, if I could make one, in the kindest way possible, one correction, if it's okay. Because you made a statement that hit me like an arrow through my heart. You're like, I didn't make a Beatles record. I didn't do that. But from an animator's perspective, if I stack up, this is like, just Carl, just listen to this when we say it.
Listen.
If I would stack up Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, Powerpuff Girls, Adventure Time, that is a discography that, if you're making the illusion of a music fan at the formative stage of Beatles coming out, that year coming out, seeing them on the Ed Sullivan and the 7 or 8 albums that it comes out, that is almost quite literally the animator's equivalent of, I was 12 years old and I saw Dexter's Lab, and then this, and then this, and then this. And that same thing that you say that is like this epochal canon event for people who grew up for rock and roll music, that is, you literally did make the Beatles albums equivalent for animators. Like, there's no question.
I'm speechless, but I thank you. I mean, it's what I wanted to do. I just didn't know I wanted to do it in cartoons.
No, Fred, you did it. And, whatever else you do with your career, as you continue to just love it too much to retire, I'm sure you'll keep inspiring all of us and making cool shit. And, Castlevania is currently one of my favorite animations that you're a part of, obviously.
Yes.
So yeah, look, we are at time now, unfortunately. I think we're just going to keep bugging you every once in a while, Fred, if you don't mind, just to come back.
I love it. I love talking to you guys. As I said to you, I think last time, Carl, you are in the world that I started in television.
Yeah.
And, I look at the work that you guys do, and I had no capability of understanding that work like that could even be done. But it was the beginning of my path. So talking to folks that do the stuff that you do always has like a special place for me. Because I just know what it takes, to accomplish that stuff.
Well, I love that, Fred. Thank you. And, I can honestly say I wouldn't be here doing this without your influence on me. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. So, all right, the last question we always ask, we have one last, is basically, is there anything or anyone in your career or anything you're doing right now that you want to shout out? Maybe, the cool book you're putting together. I think we talked about that briefly. Like, tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I'll shout out the latest creator we've been developing with. His name is Alex Crocus. You can find him on Instagram, Krokus. He just has a new book out. Where is it here? Called, can you see that on my?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Loud and Smart in color. He's a fantastic artist, a really good writer. And to the point that we've made, he has built himself a constantly growing social following, is constantly out in the world, reading his stories, showing people his characters. We're going out with him soon with a series that he has created that we're really excited about. But and I'm going to assume that the series is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, check out Alex's stuff on Instagram. I think you'll all be happy.
Awesome.
And
drop a link to that.
I'm looking at it and I've seen this stuff before. I love the idea that you found somebody who's doing 4-panel comics on Instagram, because that is, it seems like it's the easiest thing. It's the hardest thing to do. It's the hardest thing to get the writing, to be consistent, to hit the audience every time. But that's so inspiring to see that you found and developed it.
He's fabulous. But I will say, what's even harder is somebody who does such great 4-panel comics, understanding how to create characters that can last an entire story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in our history of liking this stuff, there are very few. Like Charles Schultz is an exception that proves that rule.
Mm-hmm.
That 4-panel comics can create great characters that can live beyond those panels. It's very rare.
Right.
And Alex, at least to our notion, is one of those guys who can do it.
Brilliant.
I love it. I want to give a big shout out to Andy Arkin. He was actually on the show a few episodes
He's the best.
ago. He introduced us to Fred. Forever thankful for that. Such a good dude.
He's in this book that I put together. Well, actually, a piece of work he worked on is in this book that I just put together.
I believe it. Andy's touched a lot of cool stuff over the years himself as well. So cool. And so everybody, we've been talking with Fred Seibert, who is the founder of FredFilms and Frederator Studios. You can check out his website at frederator.com. That's FREDERATOR.com and FredFilms.com. Yeah.
No Frederator.com anymore. There is one there, but I don't think I sold that company, and the website hasn't been touched in the 5 years that I sold the company.
Okay, perfect. So let's go to Fred Films, right? Correct?
You bet.
There we go.
FredFilms.com.
Okay. But listeners want to follow up with you directly. Where is there somewhere else they should go, or is Fred Films the best spot?
I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram.
Okay.
I'm not really active anywhere in social. I'm semi-active.
Mm-hmm.
So okay.
Cool.
But for people who like visual things, probably Instagram's the best place.
Okay. Awesome. All right, Fred. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And
great seeing you guys again.
Yeah, thanks so much for the time. It was amazing.
Okay. Bye-bye.
We really hope you enjoyed the show. Please like and subscribe to join us on our next journey through the world of art and business on the Pixel Retentive Podcast.